this guy. I considered myself a fairly accomplished fly fisherman, but I knew nothing about fishing snook on the beach. And I met this guy in Norm's shop 10 years ago, and I remember the day, and he probably thought, who's this guy with the New Jersey or Philly accent who pretends he knows something about fishing? What we're going to do tonight is we're going to try and set this up a little bit, if you would, a podcast or an interview. Some of you were at the South Florida Fly Fishing Exposition, and Pete and I had the honor of speaking there in terms of beach fishing for snook. I can tell you that this guy has made a difference in my life and the things that I've learned, and I take it, one of the things that I really wanted to do was be able to gift to others the way he has. And I look around this room and I see people who I know that I've been able to give some of that information. Last year, for a guy who 10 years ago didn't know anything about snook, as I was searching through my pictures this morning getting ready for this, last year I caught over 25 snook that were 30 inches or better on the beach last summer. And it came from learning from this guy. So I'm going to put Pete on the spot. I'm going to get all his secrets out here. And what I'd like to start with, Pete, is just general stuff. Let's start with the when. And I don't mean the specific time of day. Let's start with the time of year. When should we go out there and start to fish for snook?
Before I answer that, most of you know some of my background, a lot of you probably don't. I was a wildlife biologist for 32 years in Michigan. Okay, that was my background. I was trained to look at things and to look at habitats and look at animals where they are and ask the question, why are they there or why aren't they there? Or why are they using that area, the habitat that's there? I've carried that through my whole life in everything. I used to hunt deer with a bow and arrow. That's something I really enjoyed doing. But since I've gotten to be older, it's cold and I hate to go out and sit in a tree stand up north. So, 15 years ago I started fishing down here, and I had no idea what a snook was until I ran into Norm Ziegler on the beach 15 years ago. And Norm explained to me that there were these things called snook that were on the beach and you could catch them with a fly rod. I'd fished with a fly rod for a long time and thought, oh, okay, let's give that a shot. I'd caught a lot of steelhead and bass and pike and muskies on flies, but I'd never caught, anything in salt. That hooked me. The next year I came down, I fished, and we were down here every year. But over time, I found out two things. I used my observation skills, and I had no knowledge of how the hell to fish in the salt, what kind of fish were there, what you needed to do. But I just looked at it as, okay, how do you fish this? I had a couple people that luckily took me under their wing when I started, at least showed me some basic stuff.
Hold on. We'll get into the details.
Okay.
So let's take it. So here we are. It's let's call it April 15th. Actually, it's April 10th. I think it's my son's birthday. I think. Anyhow.
Yep.
So when, in terms of the calendar, Pete, do you start fishing for snook on the beach?
I usually start looking for them and fishing for them, if you want to start at the calendar year, January 1st. And I've caught snook on the Gulf Beach every month of the year except February, which is odd. But I think that has to do with weather more than anything else. But generally, you're going to find snook on the beach somewhere on Sanibel. Or I fish from Boca Grande to Marco, basically. But it's the beach, it's the Gulf Beach. Somewhere every month. They'll be there. They won't be there in big quantities, but they'll be there.
So the big months, you've taught me, are pretty much from, you would say, April to September.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And you taught me that the reason that is because snook in this area, a large portion of them will go to the beach to spawn. And we have two distinct groups of snook. We have the Gulf snook, which live out in the Gulf all year long.
Right.
And then we have the backcountry snook, who obviously live in the backcountry. And we see these snooks start to come to the beach pretty much around now,
Right.
right?
Right.
So, okay, so now let's talk about the where, but not the real specific where. And let's kind of tie it into Sanibel and Captiva in terms of where you would go to fish generally, and why, what are the conditions that would make you decide specifically where to fish? And let's get wind up there first.
Yes.
Okay?
There's a lot of things, and let me throw some general stuff out. You can fish for snook any day of the year, any place you want. But if you want to catch them, that's a whole different ballgame. And there's two things you need to remember. You got to fish where they're at, and you got to fish when they are there. Okay, these fish move. It's particularly on the beach. In the backcountry, it's different. You can count on snook they're an ambush predator. They're like pike and bass. They pretty hang in a fairly small area. They move, but you can find them off the end of a point or by dock pilings or things like that. But on the beach, it's a totally different critter. They're still an ambush feeder and predator, but they operate differently when they're on the Gulf. And
so let me ask you something. So let's say you and I, and we talk, we sit in my garage a lot of times on my beautiful Yeti chairs, and we talk about whether we're gonna fish tomorrow or not. And so we're sitting there, and the two of us are looking at each other, and we pick up the phone and we say, okay, the wind's gonna blow north tomorrow, and it's
Right.
gonna blow north, let's say, a little over 15 miles an hour. Based on Sanibel and Captiva, let's talk about, first of all, where we're not going to fish because of a north wind.
right. North winds. You got to keep in mind, those of you that live here, look at it on a bigger scale. Sanibel is a barrier island, but it's an unusual barrier island because it's crescent shaped. Okay, it's not parallel to the beach like all the other barrier islands in the U.S.
They
are.
call it a rogue.
It's a rogue island. It sits out there, and its influence, it's built because of the big flow of the Caloosahatchee River. Makes the crescent. Okay, so at the lighthouse end, it's an east-west beach. At Blind Pass, or at the end of Captiva, you're looking at a north-south beach. Just envision that. With any kind of a wind, in theory, you can fish somewhere on Captiva or Sanibel.
So basically, we would prefer a wind at our back, or especially perfectly would be over our right shoulder.
Right.
Correct?
Yep.
So that means if we have a north wind, based on what you just said, we can't go north to fish. We can't fish Turner Beach, Captiva. We can't fish Blind Pass. We can't fish Bowman's. We can't fish the rocks. And maybe we could get to Algiers or Gulf Park and start to fish. So in a north wind, generally you and I will go to the east end, correct?
Yeah, you've got to be somewhere on the island, on the Gulf side, south or whichever direction, east of Knapp's Point, which is basically where Tarpon Bay Road hits West Gulf. Okay, that's where you get to the bend. When you go towards the lighthouse from there, a north wind is going to be coming over your right shoulder. But more importantly, in the wind doing that, you got to watch the wave action, because the Gulf beaches, particularly now with all the restoration that we put on with the sands and stuff, it doesn't take much to rile that up and get it dirty. And I kind of pioneered one of these deals on fishing for snook in dirty water, because
Let's hold that.
Okay.
We're going to talk about that.
All right.
Get to
Well,
techniques. Let's stay on the wind because that's important. So basically, what you're saying is that the wave action, if we have a north wind, it's going to be too wavy generally on the north end of the island to fish.
on the north end and all the way around, depending upon two things. What the wind was doing the night before, because the Gulf is like a big tub of jelly, and if you got an onshore wind, which you have in the summertime, with a, that's pulling in, it'll raise those waves up to 1.5 feet. That gets uncomfortable to fish in, from my standpoint. I love to fish in it, but when it starts getting thigh height or so, I can't get out in the water and fish it the way I want to fish it. So it gets very uncomfortable.
So now let's talk about, we're in my garage, and again, it's another day, and we said, okay, the wind's gonna blow northeast or east tomorrow.
Yep.
So where can't we fish in an east or a northeast wind? Where are we gonna see the winds?
The way the wind's gonna be, if you're gonna look at the Gulf side of the island, and that's the other thing, we've gotta throw that in here, that there's basically two different kinds of beaches that you're gonna fish for these snook. One is the Gulf beach, which is a high energy beach. There's no cover, nothing out there, it's just sand and water breaking on the beach. That's why it is called that way, high energy. On the inside, which is generally protected more, that's where you have other structure. You normally have grass beds on the whole inside, the Pine Island Sound and the San Carlos Bay side of Sanibel on the inside. Two totally different beach situations that you find snook in, okay? So we're gonna go with this, that we're in the summertime when snook should be going out on the Gulf beach, the spawning situation where you're gonna find them. In those situations with the east wind, you don't want to be fishing on the inside anywhere. You're going to be getting whacked by the wind. You're not going to be fishing the east end because that's the highest wind.
That's one of the key points here is look at your wind in the morning to first decide where you're going to go fish. Because even though there may be fish on the east end, if we have a good hard east wind or a northeast wind, because of the way that island is shaped, you're not going to be able to fish on that east end. That's going to be the wavy. But once you get around the corner, Nats Point, Algiers, Gulf Shore Park, now you're going to be in the lee, okay? So now, where that north wind helped us on the east end, the east in the wind is going to help us as we go north.
Right.
So the more east there is in the wind, the more you're going to be able to fish what we call the numbered beaches, you know, the parking lots, 1 through 7. You're going to be able to park Bowman's, Blind Pass, and Turner.
Right.
So those, I wanted to, and I know I'm interrupting you here, but I want to make sure that we start with the wheres based on the wind.
Right.
Okay, so now Pete, we decided, and let's just pick a beach. We got a northeast wind, and we're going to go to Bowman's.
Yep.
Okay. So let's now talk about the other things before we get into the real Pete-isms in terms of how to read the beach and so forth, which you are the seer, if you will. Let's continue to talk about what are the variables that could determine where we're going to fish or how we're going to fish. And now I'm going to throw now at you. We talked about wind. Now I'm going to throw at you tide. And I'm going to throw at you sun,
Right.
or lack of sun,
Right.
okay? And then the next thing I'm going to throw at you, and again, you're the king of this, is water clarity,
Right.
turbidity. So let's start with tides. Pete.
Okay. These are all things that, as I live over by the health park, okay, off of Bass Road. Every morning when I leave, and I fish almost every day, when I leave my house to come over here, I'm running through all of this in my head as I go. And every time I get to a junction where I can make a decision, do I go right or left, do I go north or south, I make that decision basically at that point in time. And I know I've talked to a lot of people, they say, where are you gonna fish tomorrow? Tim calls me and says, where can I meet you tomorrow? I hate to make that kind of a decision the night before because it's totally variable. You can look at the weather, you can look at what the wind was going the night before, you can look at what the tide says it's going to be. But the tides down here change very dramatically depending upon wind velocity and wind direction. The wind can totally blow the tides out or it can stack them in. You've got to take that into account.
And the other thing, I'm sure all of you realized, is we have, and I read the thing where I'm not allowed to say any F words, but we have F up tides down here, okay? they are miserable to try and figure out. As a kid who grew up fishing on the East Coast, where we had a high tide and a low tide in 25 hours, we had 2 highs and 2 lows. You know down here that one day we can have 2 lows and 1 high, the next day we could have, and one day they could be 2 hours apart, the next day they could be 4 hours apart, one day they can be 3 foot change, and the next day they could be 15 inches change. So
Right.
tides here, in terms of water movement, are to me the most important thing that I've had to learn in terms of understanding what local knowledge means to fishing. And I'm not just talking about fishing the beach. I'm talking about fishing in the backcountry on a boat, or even out on our reefs and our wrecks. Water movement is key.
Yes.
Number one. So you hear some of the guides or some people talk about what they call the king tides, okay? Or they talk about the big tide. We had big tides on our full moons and our new moons. That's when the water moves the most. That doesn't mean that we can't catch fish at other times, but it does mean when we will fish during those slow times. So Pete,
And it also, if you understand what's going on out there, understanding the tides and the cycle of the tide that particular day will also tell you where you can fish along a particular piece of beach. Because an important point there was that you're gonna catch snook where the tide in the water is moving on the beach. You're not gonna catch them if there's no tide movement. You can walk along the beach, they'll be laying there either on the edge of the beach or out in 3 feet of water, facing either straight towards the beach or facing straight away, and you can cast to them until your eyeballs fall off and you're not gonna get a strike. They're not gonna move, the water's not moving, they're gonna sit there doing that. As soon as the water moves, it becomes a whole different ballgame. That's when they'll feed, okay?
Let's come back to tides when we start to talk about, again, the Pete-isms of understanding that that's not just a piece of water out there when we
Right.
get into troughs and saddles and so forth. So let's talk about sunlight or lack of sunlight.
Right. Yeah, and that's a very important thing when the water's clear, okay? Fishing for snook in clear, shallow water is totally different than fishing snook, blind casting snook in the exact same spots on the same beaches, okay? If you can see them, they can see you. And normally they have seen you before you see them, unless you get really good at it. The other thing is, and a lot of people will really get screwed up on it, even in 2 or 3 feet of clear water, if you're fishing them early in the mornings or any time beyond straight overhead in the middle of the afternoon, you've got to be very cautious and very cognizant of where the sun is, because those little rascals will pick up all of the shadows of your movement, but more importantly, of your fly line overhead. So you don't want to be trying to cast to a fish when your line is on the shadow side, going to put a shadow on that fish that you're not going to notice until the fish spooks.
This was one of the hardest things, not the hardest, but it was a aha moment for me when I started to realize, and it kind of was by accident, when I was fishing one time and I see snook moving from left to right, and I see snook moving from right to left, but I'm only catching snook that I'm casting to that are coming from the left,
To the right.
okay, that are going to the right. And the aha moment came to me in 2 ways. Number one, as hard as it was to see those snook coming from the left because it was early in the morning, and now I have the sun glaring off the water, that sun was also in the snook's eyes, okay? So they were restricted in terms of how well they could see. The other thing was that I realized as I'm casting now to the ones that are coming from the right, they can see my shadow, they can see my fly rod shadow, they can see my fly line shadow, and they can even see the shadow of the leader. Because that sun lit it up for them. However, coming from the other direction, they couldn't see it. They're blinded in the light the same way that I am, and now that sun is not creating a shadow on the water. Big aha moment for me. Also determines when I get out on the beach, which way am I going to start walking?
Which way you walk.
Okay, so if you're out there on the east end, okay, now that sun, when it rises, it's kind of in your face, okay? I know that I'm gonna walk a certain direction. If I'm fishing up Bowman's, now that sun is over my left shoulder. I'm gonna walk in a different direction. But it was a big aha moment for me for the sun. Anything else we wanna talk about?
So which direction are you gonna walk? Yeah, really.
Right.
What's that?
Well, can't you figure that out?
So we're gonna open this up to questions. But
You'll
I-
figure it out, and that's why. The important thing about that discussion and this little discussion is, if you see fish that are coming and you cast to them and they scatter like you threw a brick out there, and that's what I relate it to, you know something's wrong with your cast. They saw something. You look at it and you think, well, what the hell's happening here? You cast again, same thing happens. The fish coming, say, right to left. But you get a fish coming left to right, the exact same situation, exact same, right down the beach 50 feet further. You get two fish coming the other way, you cast to them and they both charge it and eat it, try to fight over it.
So we're going to get into the techniques, and let's hold questions till the end, but we're going to get into techniques in a little bit. And I have a technique that, not that I developed, but again, an aha moment for me in terms of being able to catch snook. So what if they're only coming from the right, okay, and you got the sun? There's still a way that you just need to adapt and some change things that you're doing. It doesn't mean that they're all going to eat, but there are some techniques. So let's talk now about water clarity, Pete, because that really is going to determine how we're going to fish any particular day, in terms of the real techniques we're going to use.
Yes, and I'll tell you up front, I catch 75% of the snook I catch are blind cast, okay?
That's because the water's dirty.
Because the water's dirty, and I fish cloudy, dirty water. I love to sight cast for snook. That's the ultimate trick in my book. But anybody that spends any time fishing on Sanibel or anywhere here in Southwest Florida, if you get one day out of 10 where you can have ideal sight casting conditions on the beach, you're lucky. From June through August, the end of August. I've kept track of it over the last 15 years, and that's what you see. If you want to catch snook, you want to fish when the fish are there. And I can tell you that the fish are there doing the same things when the water's dirty as they are when it's clear. So if you only fish clear, bright water when you can see them, you're passing up a lot of really good fishing.
So let's get into, again, I'll say it for the third or fourth time, let's get into the real Pete-isms here. And if there's anything that I learned in fishing with Pete and watching him on the beach, is not so much not only what he does, but what he doesn't do in terms of fishing certain places and certain places on the beach. When I first started fishing down here, and even though I did a lot of surf fishing and a lot of fly fishing in Jersey, for some reason I couldn't connect the dots that I knew there was structure on the beaches in Jersey where I fished. I knew there was jetties, I knew there was holes, I knew there were sloughs. But for whatever reason, when I came down here, I didn't connect that occurred here. All I saw was this beautiful Gulf that was basically the same height everywhere with very little waves, and I saw this beautiful sandy beach that hardly had a dune in it and so forth, and I didn't know where to fish. However, going out with him and watching him, and I'm going to turn this over to him because no one knows how to read what's going on underneath the water with him. So Pete, let's talk about saddles, troughs, waves, shells,
Beach structure.
beach structure.
Okay, that is one of the things. How many of you have been out on one of the past beach ventures we've done? Okay, so you know kind of what the discussion was at that point in time. You know, there's things that you can look for. And again, that's where my biologist background and inquisitive nature comes in, is that when you walk down to the Gulf Beach here, anybody that's new and getting into this, the one thing you look at that and say, just like Bob said, God, this is kind of neat. It's the whole thing's all the same. Where do I start to fish? I'll fish here and I'll just keep going. That's great, and you can do that, and you might catch fish. But if, again, you got to go back to my one opening comment there, that it's easier to catch fish when you fish where the fish are at. Okay, and if you've got a quarter mile of beach that on the surface or in your mind, if you've never fished before, looks the same. It looks like a huge bathtub out there of nice clean water, wavy water, whatever you want to do. You can look at it that way, but if you want to be successful, and I can equate this to most of you that have fished in rivers for whatever kind of fish, trout, steelhead, smallmouth bass, whatever. Fish the Gulf beaches like it was a 40-foot wide river running parallel to the beach. Okay, that's one important piece. And you say, okay, well that's cool, but what difference does it make? The difference it makes is that the bulk of the fish that you're going to see and catch on the Gulf beaches are going to be within 40 feet of where you're standing, if you're standing on the edge of the water. And a lot of them are going to be closer. But they move that because that is where there is a natural movement of water when the tide is moving. And you can tell where it is. I can't tell you at any particular spot, but you'll learn it over time that with an incoming tide or an outgoing tide at this level, at this speed, this is the direction that tide should be moving. And you just throw your line out there, and if you're observant at all, you'll be able to tell, yes, it's moving this way or it's moving that way. It makes a big difference. And that will tell you, okay, the fish and snook, and most of the fish operate the same way. They don't swim with the current. They swim into the current. They're built to do that. That's the way a fish is built biologically. They've got to have the resistance. That's why when there is no water flow, those fish don't move very far, because it takes them too much effort to move if they don't have water. It's like an airplane. An airplane can't fly if the wind's not blowing. Or a bird can't fly well if they can't whip their wings along hard enough. It's the same thing with fish. When the water is moving, they're built to move in the water. The water helps them aerodynamically or hydrodynamically, I guess it is with fish. They move, and snook, being the predators, move with their heads into the flow. Sometimes they'll back off and come down, but for the most part, they're moving into the flow. Keep those things in mind.
So you and I walk down to a beach.
Yes, I was just getting to that.
Okay.
Okay, when you get to the beach and you look at this thing and you say, okay, it's a 30-foot wide or 40-foot wide trough that or a river we're gonna fish. You look down the beach, and to most people it said, oh, this is the same all the way, but it's not. There's things that I look at when I walk down there. One is the water. Well, the first thing I look at is obvious things that you look for, and the first thing that I look at, if it's a brand new beach, is fish. Okay, fish and birds are two telling things. If you can see fish, that's great, because then you don't have to, boggle your mind with where to go. But not just seeing the fish, but seeing signs of fish, seeing swirls, seeing flashes, seeing bait cascading out of the water, seeing the boils under the bait. Those are that is telling you, and watching the bait, a ball of bait, particularly glass minnows, as they're coming down there, if you see them move and you see a hole in the middle of them, there's a fish there. And if you're there between mid-May and September, it's probably a snook that's making that hole in that bait. Those fish are underneath that bait school, in the bait school, around the edges of it, in front and back. That's an obvious way. If you find the bait, you find fish busting on the bait, fish hell out of it, okay? But that's rare to find unless you're really on the ball and you're out there a lot. Look for birds. And one of the things that's really obvious when you're walking along the beach in the summer, if you look ahead and see a blue heron and some egrets, particularly egrets, that are scattered along the beach, standing along the edge, you ought to be getting ready to catch snook, because there's usually, that means that there's glass minnows, there's small bait up tight to the beach that those egrets are catching. And there's gonna be snook with them. Okay, you may not see them, the snook will be out in 3 feet of water, but they're keeping those fish pushed in close to the beach. It's another thing you wanna look for. If you see pelicans, pelicans don't mean a lot, but what they tell me is that they're looking at small bait. Okay, they don't dive on big bait normally, they're on small bait. But watch them, and if they dive, are they successful? And you watch a lot of these young pelicans in the summer, they're diving, they may dive 20 times before they come up with something. Don't just say, oh, there's pelicans out there 30 feet going right down along. They're not catching anything, they're trying to learn what they're doing. Don't get fooled by them. But if you see terns out there, terns and gulls that are dipping, terns are very efficient. When they dip, they usually 50–60% of the time they're successful. They pick something up. Look at what they're getting. And there's usually little white bait, pilchards, or it can be glass minnows. Watch for them. If you see them picking stuff out there 30–40 feet, you ought to be casting around there, because there's probably snook in that too.
Okay, structure.
Yep. Now, when you've exhausted that, you walk out to the beach and it's just nothing there, it's dead. No birds, no bait. Usually I just wind her up and go home, but
No, that's not true.
no. But that makes it a challenge, because then you gotta go look for them. And again, the beach isn't all the same. As somebody who's hunted deer a lot and archery deer hunted, where you gotta squeeze deer around close enough to shoot them at less than 50 feet, 60 feet. It's the same thing on the beach. You wanna look at, is there structure on the beach that's gonna squeeze fish down close to the beach? Because they're moving parallel to the beach. You gotta assume that's the case. Instead of fishing 200 feet of where there's no structure, fish a place where there's structure that squeezes them down. And when you look at it, these snook use the beach contour, the bottom contour, just like it was tree roots or whatever that they use in the backcountry. You'll find them, if it's a 4-inch or 6-inch difference in contour, they'll use that as they're traveling up and down the beach, parallel to the beach. Find those edges. And the two things that the things that are the most obvious are points where there's a cut that comes back in that provides a point, or you'll find a bar with a trough. Okay, and if you look at we'll start with the troughs, the bar with the trough. Those are the easiest ones to find, and it's best to look for those at low tides. They're obvious, particularly in the summer when you got the big
This guy
4-foot switches.
and people who catch a lot of snook go out at low tide and sometimes never take a rod with them.
Right.
They go out strictly to look at what the beach is at low tide. Because there's times, if you go out at high tide, you may not think that there's a trough there, because that trough, which is basically, if this were the beach side, then this trough comes down and there's a bar, and then it goes out to the Gulf. At high tide, you can't see that bar. At low tide, you can see that bar. And I mark in my mind, and he does too, that we know that that's going to be a place with the right tidal conditions that fish will hold. Trough is if you ask me what the single thing that I learned from him to go find fish, is to go find a trough. Now there's some definite variables with a trough, and again, I learned this from him. If you've got waves breaking across the trough, and those waves are generally less, if that bar is less than a foot deep, chances are those snook are not going to be in the trough.
Right.
And the reason is they're not going to let themselves get trapped in there by dolphin. Getting over that bar is the most important thing in their life other than spawning or eating. So if that bar is covered properly, then those snook have a chance of being in there. But once you can see the bottom of the bar, or you can see the color of the bar through the waves, the chances are those snook are not going to be in there, they're not going to get caught in there. But that doesn't mean that we may not fish there, or we may wait, and again, this is where your tide comes into play. Okay, Pete and I go out, we go to a spot, we see the trough, we say, okay, and I can hear him saying it to me in 100 times. We gotta wait for another 18 inches to come over here. We should go fish somewhere else and come back here in an hour and 22 minutes. Okay, and sure enough, we'll come by in an hour and 22 minutes, and the trough will be covered, and the fish will be, and there's fish. Okay, so and the other thing is where these troughs end is what I call the saddle. And if you look at it, those are really those points that stick out. If you're walking along the beach, you see those points that go out. Those are also great places to fish, especially sight fishing when the fish aren't in the trough. Because those fish will follow that bar out. They'll be running along that bar, waiting till it gets high enough to come in, but you'll see them coming along the bar, and all of a sudden they'll get to the saddle, and they have to cross over the saddle. And if you get yourself positioned on one of those saddles on a good sight fishing day, if the fish are there, you'll see them, and that's a great technique to catch them.
Right. When you've got these parallel bars that are running parallel to the beach, and you can see them when the water's low, you'll see a bar, and some of them are a quarter mile long, and they'll run from where they hit the beach or come close to the beach. That's the shallowest part, and then as they go along the beach further down, they get shallower, okay? When you look at that, there's gonna be a real flow of water down that trough as it's coming in and going out, okay? It's tough to explain, but when you're looking at that, along the top, if that bar is even all the way for a quarter of a mile, if you're looking at it with a low tide, you're gonna see spots where there's a saddle in it. This is other than at the head. You'll see a place that runs for 100 yards, then there's a dip, maybe 20, 30 feet, 40 feet, where it's 6 inches lower than it is on both sides.
That's the drop.
And you watch that spot, and you watch it enough, and you'll see that's when the water is going out. That's the place where the bait and the snook go out of the trough. One of the places they go out to get into the Gulf, because the water's still higher there and it's moving in for them to go out. And when it's coming in, the snook and the bait are sitting on the outside of that bar waiting to get in. The bait fish want to get the hell away from those snook and the trout that are out there pounding on them. As soon as that water moves through that slot in that bar, the bait comes in there. And usually within a half hour after it's deep enough for the bait to come in, the snook will follow them in and they'll be in the same places. And you can save yourself a lot of screwing around by just standing around and fishing those slots in that trough. Same thing where this bar hits the beach. As the water gets higher,
It's a track point.
fish moving down, coming into that bar as the water gets higher. They come in very readily, and they keep getting squeezed down as they get close to that point. When they get to the point, it may only be, there's some places that I know right now where it's 8 feet across, but it's 3 feet deep, 1.5 feet off the beach. On the other side of it, it's 12 inches of water, but there's a slot right there. It's a deep slot. And when that water gets down, those last fish that are in there are moving up. They're gonna be right there. And rather than casting 40 or 50 feet across this trough every time, it's easier to just cast 40 or 50 feet down, parallel to the beach, and drag it up very slowly into that slot, because that's where those fish are gonna be. And when they get a fly come by them, next to them from behind, that's a trigger point for snook.
So this is where, in my mind, I start to put things together. We talked about tide, we talked about wind, we talked about structure. And if you said to me, Bob Brooks, what's your nirvana, if you will? It's when I go to bed at night and I look at the tide chart and I say, holy mackerel, we've got a tide that's gonna turn, it's a high tide, it's gonna turn to outgoing just before sunrise, okay? And I know where the trough is. I'm gonna go there before that sun gets up, and I'm gonna blind cast that trough, but I'm gonna start casting at the head of the trough, as Pete described it, where that trough comes and meets the beach. I'm gonna walk down to that spot, and I'm gonna start casting into the trough, parallel to the beach, fan cast a little to get out towards the bar, and I'm gonna work it down, work it down, work it down. And as I said when we started this, and this is true, I caught a lot of big fish last year. I can tell you that over half of those fish were under those nirvana conditions. Okay, am I right, Pete?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
that's another trick. If you want to target big snook, you can fish these things just like we're talking about, but in the trough, as an example. Okay, if you want to catch big snook, they will be in that trough. And people talk about snook being right up next to the beach, and they are. But the big fish in general, unless somebody's caught them and they're still trying to recover from, the uric acid and everything in them, they're going to be back out in deep water. And those big snook, when they come in on the beach, they are never more than, I call it, 2 strong tail pushes from thigh deep or waist deep water. They don't like to be right in there and
They
shallow
want to get
water.
out of Dodge when it's time to get out of Dodge.
Yeah. So that's why if you find them in those troughs, when they're full, they are going to be on the inside edge of the bar. Those bars, if you wade out to them one time, just try it and see. You wade out to that trough, across the trough to the bar, and you'll find that face of that bar facing the beach is almost vertical. That is a tremendous structural change for those fish. They love it.
So
And it'll
this-
be a 4-foot
If
difference.
this is the beach, okay, my hand's here on the beach, we're standing here. The trough is gonna come like this, and when it reaches the bar, it's gonna come up like this, okay? Those fish will like to lay in there. Now, don't get me wrong that you can't catch big fish when the tide's not high. It just means that they're not gonna be in the trough.
Right.
Doesn't mean that they're not out there. It just changes where you fish and how to fish. And when we have those low tide conditions, that's where I pray for at least some decent looking water clarity so I can see those fish starting to cruise up and down the beach.
Yeah.
Before I forget, Pete, and this is something that's the most remarkable thing, I want you to talk about the shells.
Yeah.
Okay, this is absolutely one of the most remarkable observations that I've ever heard from a guy fishing the beach. So listen to this carefully.
Well, most people wouldn't look at that. Again, my normal curiosity and when I walk down the beach, particularly when the water's crummy, when there's high waves and when it's dirty water, when you can't see the bottom in front of you out there 2 feet. I'm always probing, well, if I'm not fishing, and that's one of the other points, you're not gonna catch fish if you don't have your fly in the water. Anybody that fishes with me knows I have that fly in the water an awful lot. I don't like to have 14 back casts. I like to pick it up, slap it down, one back cast and out with my intermediate line. That's the way I fish it. I don't like to do 4 or 5 back casts. I don't like to screw around with it. When I'm walking down the beach by myself, I'll just take out 20 feet of line and as I'm looking, and I'll just keep roll casting it ahead of me, out about 10 feet, jigging along as I go.
We're gonna get the techniques, get to the shells.
No, I will. But as I'm doing that, I'm not wasting my time, but I know I'm not gonna catch any fish. If I do, it's a thrill. But I'm looking for things because you can't see what's in the water. But what you can see is you can look at the beach that's out of the water, and you can look at what's on the beach out of the water, which on Sanibel are shells. Okay, to everybody, a shell is a shell, but they're not. If you look at them closely, you're gonna find patches of the beach where it's just finely ground shell you can't even hardly see a full shell. It's just pieces of shell for 50 feet. That should tell you something. If you're inquisitive at all, what would that tell you? If you're walking down the beach and the shells disappeared, and all of a sudden it was just crushed shells for 50 feet, what would that tell you?
Water activity, water movement?
It's a lot of water movement because for the